鬼岛之音
Ghost Island Media.
Surprise! Nature Nate is back in Taiwan and back in your feed. We're here with another episode on COP30. Last time you heard me talk about COP28. There was a COP29 in between, but let's just stick with what's happening now. I'm Nature Nate, and this is Waste Not, Why Not, a sustainability science show from Ghost Island Media. Right? So it's been a while, and I'm back, and as ever, I'm watching COP. This year, I didn't go, but I did go to Climate Week in New York, which is considered by many in the sustainability field to be the pre-COP, if you will. And Climate Week New York happens at the same time as the UN General Assembly, so this was September 21st. It was the end of September, so why not have the most important pre-COP climate event in the United States? And, well, it's because that's where Wall Street is. So we have to have the most important climate event, pre-climate event, next to Wall Street so we can get investors and business leaders interested and build that consensus before we go to COP30. So I went to New York Climate Week, and at Climate Week, there are more than 1,000 events that take place across the city. There's an estimated 100,000 attendees, and it's sort of spreading all these climate events throughout the city. You have university partners hosting events, and then you also have really important groups like CDP, which controls and organizes RE100 and the science-based targets. They host the main events. So I attended that, and you could hear a wide range of different topics from celebrities talking about the need for climate activism, from farmers talking about the impacts on agriculture from climate change, and you also hear from corporates about what they're doing for sustainability. So one interesting thing is when you go to multiple climate events all around the world, you start to see what a company's global push for carbon looks like, because you're going to see them speak in different countries and environments. And one company that I think is really interesting is called Fortescue, and that's one of Australia's largest mining companies. But they've committed to something called Real Zero, where they are not going to use carbon offsets. And as a mining company, they're trying to reach net zero. Now, you might say, okay, a mining company reaching net zero, led by one of Australia's richest people, what's really going on there? But the funny thing is that I have essentially been following, his name is Andrew Forrest, the CEO of this company. I've essentially been following Andrew Forrest's boat all around the world. So at COP28, I was invited on to this special boat. It uses an ammonia-based fuel, which is really important for shipping, because for global shipping, we use bunker fuel, which is the most polluting type of fuel imaginable. And one way to reduce global shipping emissions is to change the fuel and use ammonia. Yeah, believe it or not, you can use ammonia to power a container vessel. And so this guy, his company rather, is taking this boat all around the world. And I'm seeing this boat in Dubai. I get on the boat. Then, living in London for 2 years, the boat pulls up into the harbor by my house. And then, New York Climate Week, he has the boat again. So you can kind of, as you go to these environmental events, track the language, track the boats, and track the stories that are going on as you move around. And it's interesting to see how some companies remain committed to climate change, even when the situation's difficult. Fortescue hasn't changed their targets. They're an Australian company. They're still committed. And they've taken it all around the world trying to push this point. So Climate Week is a funny place where you can kind of see all these different corporate, institutional, investor strategies play out at a global stage. And it's a good window if you don't want to travel all the way to COP, or you feel a bit weird going to a climate negotiation as someone who's not negotiating or advocating for an issue. I also saw Mark Ruffalo. And in my professional work, I don't talk too much about the advocacy of celebrities, but Mark Ruffalo was pretty convincing. He talked about Standing Rock, which, if you don't know, is an indigenous-led movement to prevent the expansion of an oil pipeline across the U.S. And he said it was one of the most important climate events that drove change all around the world. This small group of indigenous people blocking or attempting to block, eventually the blockade was broken, to block a pipeline. And that's really interesting when a celebrity uses their social currency to uplift a small activist movement. Jane Fonda, also, who's been doing this much longer than Mark Ruffalo, by the way, was also on stage, and she was calling for a renewed commitment, mostly in the US, but a renewed commitment to democracy. And if we don't have democracy, we won't have a way to stop climate change. So it's interesting to see these celebrities. They're not the most important people. They're not policymakers or scientists or investors or activists or innovators, but they play a really important role in drawing attention to these issues. And I know that there's this temptation to go, oh, a celebrity cares about climate change, but that's good. We need many, many, many more celebrities to care about climate change. The attitude at Climate Week this year was a stark contrast to other climate events I've gone to in the past. Because the United States is pulling out of climate change, the conversation has returned to kind of a 2016 era of what can we do? What can we still do? And are we talking about climate in the right way? We're not talking about things like, way back in 2024 when the US had passed the Inflation Reduction Act, we weren't talking about scaling clean technologies in the same way. We're talking about changing our language to try and convince people to still care about climate in a new way. So just a year or two ago, we were on a triumphant sort of discussion about clean tech investing and how to move the climate conversation forward. Now we're in the retreat. Now we're talking about AI's energy demand. We're talking about changing priorities in the US administration and how do we still convince people to do climate. So the feeling at Climate Week before COP was that things will not be very good. And that is because at this current COP, COP30, countries have to submit new carbon targets. And we got a preview at Climate Week. And the preview was, it's bad. But that's enough about Climate Week and those types of things. Let's talk about COP30 itself and why it's important and maybe address some of the myths around it. COP30, the 30th time the world has come together to try and create binding legislation to stop climate change. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions I see about COP online, and I guess I'll just do a bit of quick myth busting because if you're listening to this, you probably have people in your life who are skeptical of COP and why it's important. So the first myth that I often see, and especially about this COP, is why are they hosting the COP in the Amazon? Isn't it funny that they're going to tear down the trees to build a conference to talk about climate change? Isn't it funny that all of these activists have to fly and go all the way to the Amazon to have this conversation? Why don't they have it on Zoom? So there's a couple pieces there. The first is, yeah, there's probably some issues with hosting the climate event in the Amazon, but people live in the Amazon. These are real living communities that are going to be building things anyway. And if this is a chance to maybe improve the development in that region and give them an opportunity to advocate directly to almost every country in the world about climate change, that's probably worth the several tons of carbon it took to make this area. Now, that doesn't mean that the same amount of people should be going to this climate event as, let's say, COP28 in Dubai. Dubai is a desert oil metropolis that's already built up. It hosts major expos. There was more than 100,000 people who attended for COP28. If you add together all the delegates and lobbyists and people who just wanted to go for fun. Now, for the COP in COP30 in Brazil, that number is going to be substantially smaller, but the people going there, hopefully, are the ones who should be going there because it's the only stage in the world where you can have an indigenous activist talk directly to the largest emitters and ask them, beg them, demand of them that they do something about climate change. The carbon emissions from that are inconsequential. I used to do carbon accounting for professional services companies. A CEO will fly 250 times a year in business class, of course, or possibly a private jet. And each one of those flights in business class is 5 times the carbon emissions of an economy class flight. So this CEO is flying 250 times a year, and each time they fly, they're emitting 5 times the emissions that you emit. So the issue is really not having a once-a-year global gathering where people come and talk about climate change and how to reduce it. It's not ironic that people have to fly there. It's a reality of the system that we live in that they're actively trying to change. The alternative is to have a Zoom call. There's less engagement. This is an okay way to spend emissions if it means we can create a global consensus and actually stop climate change. So don't fall into this trap of, well, you want to stop climate change, but you fly and you go to this conference. Yeah, well, I'm a human being on Earth and I have to operate within those limits. If I wanted to be perfectly sustainable, I'd be very difficult to talk to people. Okay, that's one myth. I saw this on the Reddit environment subreddit, which I go on occasionally. The thread said, COP is a playground for rich elites. Brazil has sent more than 7,000 delegates, and even Nigeria has sent more than 700 delegates to COP this year. It's just a playground. They don't really need to be there. If you haven't participated in the COP process before, you might not realize that all of the delegates that come from these countries are not necessarily fossil fuel lobbyists or governments. Countries apply for these delegations, and then they can invite anyone they want. Indigenous activists, educators, people who run NGOs, climate technologists, just kids who care about climate change. So looking at the number of delegates doesn't tell you about the composition of the delegates. And we shouldn't think that just because more people are going from a global south country to COP, it's just having fun in the Amazon. Most of these people are going to be in and around the negotiations, spending 2 weeks inside trying to create this new binding legislation, which is really important. But we should probably talk about like what that binding legislation is and what they're negotiating at COP this year. So COP30 is important because it's been 10 years since COP21 in Paris. We had to skip a year because of COVID. At COP21, we set up a framework so countries can report their carbon emissions, and they do that through INDCs, which is their declarations of reducing carbon emissions. Essentially, they try and have their own country-level carbon footprint, and they say, we're going to do X tons of carbon reduction, and we're going to do it using these technologies and these policies. And the reason we do that is because otherwise, climate change is a bit of a prisoner's dilemma. If one country drops all their emissions, but everyone else is a high emitter, then they're just going to take advantage of that, and we're still going to have climate change. We need everyone to put their cards on the table and say how much they're going to reduce. This is especially important because US and Europe are the largest historical emitters, and carbon stays in the atmosphere. That's why we have climate change. And China is now the world's largest emitter, and their emissions maybe have peaked. So if you live in a country like Colombia, Fiji, let's say Nigeria, you're not emitting as much as these other countries. So you need to understand that when you're making a commitment to reduce your carbon emissions, others are doing that too. We're all agreeing to work on this group project together. And given our own development contexts, we're going to try and hit that carbon target. So we need these INDCs, and they have to be meaningful because we need all of the countries to push as hard as they can to reduce emissions together. But this year, the INDCs are probably a bit weak. And there's another deeper issue at play with COP at the moment, which is that the US has cut funding to the UN. So now there's about $1 billion shortfall in the UN's budget. And the UN runs COP, runs environment programs. At the same time, there's another big empty pot of money, which is the money that's necessary for countries to adapt to climate change. At COP28, countries came together to agree to pay lower income countries to help them adapt to climate change. But now at COP30, that bucket of money is almost empty. Money that was agreed to be established called a loss and damages fund. And this is as intended to have the money from richer countries go to poorer countries to compensate them for the damages from climate change and to help them adapt. But historically, the US has really resisted this type of fund because they don't want to be held liable for the damage from climate change, which the US kind of caused a lot of. And so now it's even worse because the US isn't in COP at all, so there's no way they can contribute. Europe is hesitant to contribute unless others do, and it's this game we run into where it's a prisoner's dilemma. Nobody wants to be the one putting up all the money and getting taken advantage of. So there are many pots of climate finance that have decreased. Most seriously is the UN budget overall, and then this loss and damages fund, which they're now trying to find financing for at COP30. Perhaps by the time this podcast comes out, there will be some more financing there. The context for COP at the moment is extremely difficult because even back at COP28, there isn't this same global consensus where we have all these alliances. You have countries kind of lining up on different sides. It's not quite a Cold War, but you have these really big conflicts like Russia and Ukraine, Israel and Palestine. There's, historical alliances that were really strong, like Canada and the US. They're kind of fragmenting and fracturing apart, at least publicly. We're not really in a space where countries are coming together to agree. There's not enough money. And that is actually why COP is more important than ever. There needs to be a global stage where these countries can come together and have these debates in an open, transparent way. It's maybe a bit of a relief, actually, that the US has pulled out of COP30, because there are plenty of other countries that are in COP and in these negotiations that are high emitters, Saudi Arabia, Russia. So they still have a voice at the table and can shape this language, but the US has pulled out of COP and is not shaping it at all. Or it kind of is, actually, because state-level representatives are still going to COP. California's Governor Newsom, went to COP. And in fact, there are 24 US states that represent 54% of GDP that are still committed to COP. So if you can't agree on just previous norms that you've had as international entities, it's going to be very difficult to negotiate the specifics of climate change. And it's going to become one more bargaining piece, which again is why it's important that we have these negotiations in person. We have these opportunities for activists to come and make their voices heard. By the way, one really interesting thing that happened at COP30 this year is that indigenous activists stormed the negotiating area. Stormed is maybe an ironic word for climate change, but they entered the negotiation area in kind of a dramatic fashion to let them know that indigenous peoples are not happy with the progress that's been made on climate change. That hasn't really happened at COP in a very long time. You'll see some disruptions. I was at an event in Climate Week and two activists stood up and tried to call out Toyota for being a climate denier, and they tried to hold up a sign and security moved quickly. You don't see these things as often as you would think based on kind of like parodies in the media and stuff about environmental activists. But this year at COP30, activists did enter. From what I've seen and heard from friends at COP, there was also kind of this large people's march, and it was the largest they'd ever seen of different groups coming together in advocacy for a stronger climate deal. So COP this year, the dynamics have changed. China, from what I've read, has the largest delegation, and they're playing a very strong role. The financial realities that China has created with renewable technology is pretty impressive, honestly. Kind of weird thing to say, but the price of wind, solar, and batteries has reached its lowest levels ever, and China is driving the EV revolution. But China has some other stuff going on, so it's kind of complicated, but we have this era where the US has pulled back, China's stepped forward, Europe's a bit caught in the middle. We don't have that same kind of consensus building we did, let's say, way back in COP21. Obama was president. He was asking China nicely to kind of like agree to carbon targets, and that's when China started to really back renewables. Now, 10 years later, basically, from COP21, we see just a very different landscape, and that makes these kinds of like broad climate negotiations difficult. But what this doesn't have any influence on is what you can do in your own space to try and stop climate change. So one thing I covered at COP28 was sort of Taiwan's growing presence. It's always awkward, for Taiwan to go to UN events. But what I was pretty delighted to see was at COP30, there is much more of a stronger Taiwan presence. There's NGOs like the Taiwan Climate Action Network. There's research institutes going. They're trying to share what Taiwan's doing in terms of its carbon market development and its price on carbon. There's, if I had to guess in my head, there's probably more than 100 delegates from Taiwan who are at COP. I don't have the official number, but if anyone knows, let me know. Taiwan is continuing to go to COP. And not only that, Taiwan has not pulled away from sustainability, unlike other countries. The stock exchange in Taiwan requires ESG reporting. Effectively, most companies in Taiwan have to report their carbon emissions. Whether or not they act on them is a separate conversation, but there is really still momentum and interest in sustainability here that hasn't gone away just because the US has pulled back. Taiwan is an exporter to many markets, and if you look globally, the only country really pulling away from sustainability and climate change is the US government administration. US state entities, many of them that were committed before, are still committed. I'm impressed to say that Taiwan is still pushing sustainability. Their recent Asia-Pacific Circular Economy Hotspot was also hosted here in Taiwan, which is encouraging as during COVID, Taiwan kind of pulled away from circular economy because of concerns around COVID, the economic impact, and people only wanting to use single-use items because of COVID. So seeing Taiwan's continued interest in renewables and sustainability and circularity and advocating on a global stage is encouraging, even though the UN may not reciprocate that love back to Taiwan. So what do we take away from COP30? Well, for one thing, don't let people kind of bully you into thinking it's a useless exercise. It's the only venue in the world where indigenous activists get to yell at fossil fuel producers. So I think for that alone, it is worth the price and worth the carbon. Two, we need these international networks. With COVID, which, doesn't feel that long ago to many, we were only doing things remotely, but it really is important to connect with others working on climate change physically together. If you can only do remote, that's fine too. There's nothing wrong with that. But being together and co-creating solutions and building durable networks of activism and change are really the way forward. Another thing to take away is that, and this is something I heard at Climate Week, this is something I've known, this is something that people talk about constantly and is very clear at COP, is that we have all the tools to stop climate change. We've had them for a few years now, but now they're especially at the price point that we need to essentially stop using fossil fuels. We have alternatives for heating. We have heat pumps. We have electrification. We have electric vehicles. We have micromobility, e-bikes, things like that. The most efficient type of transportation ever made, by the way, is an e-bike. The price of batteries has dropped, so energy storage is becoming available. And in many parts of the world, energy storage plus solar plus wind is the cheapest combination of power we've ever created. This is not the world we lived in 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we didn't have cheap, cost-effective solar. Wind was in many places unproven. 10 years ago, wind was illegal in Taiwan, by the way, offshore wind. We didn't have e-bikes. We didn't have this kind of energy storage. We didn't have the technology to use microgrids. So we really have all the tools today to stop climate change. But point 4 or whatever point, AI energy use is growing drastically. And this is complicating carbon targets significantly. We have Microsoft, who a few years ago, 2020, proposed to be carbon negative, and they were going to have one of the strongest net zero targets. However, you might have heard that they do a lot with AI now. So they're going to miss that target. And the big tech companies that were previously pushing net zero and renewable energy are now full on into AI. That doesn't mean that they've all abandoned their goals. They're still buying renewable energy, but AI is really pushing power markets in a kind of a weird twist. This is incentivizing renewables because all of the energy is needed. But at the same time, we're keeping on gas plants longer. We're keeping on coal plants longer because they know that they can sell that electricity for AI and compute. So as much as we have these tools and technologies to stop climate change today, we have new pressures and energy demands that we never imagined in the form of, large language models, generative AI and image generation, agents, and then now people are talking about having robots, which are going to be another source of energy demand. So can we fight against all of these trends? Do we want to fight against all of these trends? Do some of these trends have climate benefits that aren't fully realized yet? I don't really know, but I think these are good questions to explore as we're thinking about COP. It's not a matter of living with less and trying to just have as low impact a life as possible. It's about, and this is really clear if you look at the climate movement now, they're reframing it to be about abundance and regeneration, to have a better world through stopping climate change and moving away from fossil fuels. This whole binary either or thing doesn't connect with people, and it's not a winning message for business either. So we need to have kind of a new framework and approach that we're starting to see at COP30, and we're starting to see this at conferences everywhere. And it's something I'm starting to see in my new role in Taiwan. So as I mentioned at the start, I'm back in Taiwan. I've taken a new job at an innovative branding agency called Red Peak, where we work with corporates all around the world, but a lot of them are technology, and we try and help them do sustainable communication. So I was brought on to really drive this sustainable communication and fusing it with branding. Why I'm interested in this is someone who was an environmental expert in sustainability, is that because for a long time it feels like you're competing with marketing and branding when you're trying to get your sustainability claims across. But what if there's another path? What if you could have sustainability fuse with branding and marketing, and it's done in a ethical, responsible, and even an innovative and creative way? I think there's opportunities for sustainability to learn from branding, for branding to learn from sustainability. And so that's what I'm here doing in my new role, and I'm very happy to be back in Taiwan. Hopefully you'll hear me again soon. I'm Nature Nate, and this is Waste Not, Why Not, a sustainability science show about energy, ocean, and waste. This was a production from Ghost Island Media, produced by executive producer Emily Y. Wu, Zach Chang, and it's edited by Wayne Tai. Recorded here in Taipei, Taiwan at Future Ward. Bye-bye.